We're continuing to look at the Olivet Discourse. In the last episode, we looked at Matthew's version, or a little bit from Matthew's version of the Olivet Discourse, comparing it to Josephus's account of the events leading up to and surrounding 70 AD. Incredibly important to understand the background of what happened historically around the fall of Jerusalem and how monumental that was for the Jewish people in the first century. That basically 70 AD and then kind of the aftermath of that leading up finally to the Bar Kokhba rebellion, that sort of set the trajectory between the two different forms of Judaism that continued forward after that. The first one was Jesus's form of Judaism, Messianic Judaism, which became eventually Christianity, and Rabbinic Judaism, that focused not on the temple and the priesthood, but on the synagogue and the study of Torah and the rabbis. So those kind of diverged through the events of what happened in and around 70 AD. And so Jesus's words in the Olivet Discourse are pretty monumental. And they're also very much in line with the Hebrew prophets, as well as other sectarian groups of the time within Judaism. Some of what we find in the Qumran community, the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example. There was a lot of wrestling within Judaism in the first century of who was and was not truly part of Israel, the people of God. And as our friend Jason Staples has documented thoroughly in his book on the subject, the concept of Jews or Judaism and Israel were not synonymous. There was overlap, but they weren't the same. Jews were a subset of Israel, and there was a lot of inter-Jewish dialogue, a lot of polemics even, about who was and wasn't technically part of Israel and would ultimately have a share in the life to come. And for us on this side of history, especially this side of Christian history, there's a tendency to sort of make Judaism monolithic in the first century. You know, Jews believed this, and then Christians came and believed this. It's not the case. That's an overly simplistic understanding, as even Jewish scholars themselves would be the first to admit. Judaism has never been homogeneous. There have always been different strands, different sects, different movements, different emphases. So having an understanding of that will help us as we navigate Jesus's Olivet Discourse, seeing what the temple itself eventually would come to stand for, how it would be viewed even before the time of Jesus, even going back to when the Essenes left and completely repudiated the temple and went off into the wilderness to await God vindicating them for their rejection of the temple, which they had seen as utterly and completely corrupt. So the temple was a lightning rod in the first century and continued all the way up until its destruction in 70 AD. Now, what we're going to do in a future video in this series is we're going to go through each version of the Olivet Discourse. You know, in the first video here, we compared all three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and we showed, you know, what some of them have that others don't and how they arrange their material. So then the next step, that's kind of like follows how I think Bible study should go in general. Like you should get a big picture view of a subject. And then only after you have a big picture view, should you then drill down and start looking at the details. So we're kind of, you know, in between, like we've had the 30,000 foot view, and now we're going to zoom kind of down into maybe like a helicopter view of the Olivet Discourses individually. So in this video, we're going to look at an aspect of Mark, kind of an overview of it, the proposed structures. And then after that, we'll do like a more detailed look at Mark's version of the Olivet Discourse. And we're starting with Mark because Mark was probably the earliest version of it. Most scholars think Mark was the first gospel. Nothing really hinges on whether you put Matthew or Mark first, but Mark is the shortest of the three versions of the Olivet Discourse. So we're going to start there. And then when we look at Matthew and then when we look at Luke and we see how they have shaped and used this material that goes back to Jesus teaching in Jerusalem, how they slightly differ both from each other and from Mark. And the goal is at the end of this series, you walk away with more of an understanding of the Olivet Discourse than you had certainly when you started, but also you see how important the Olivet Discourse is and how incredibly distorted the Olivet Discourse has been by a lot of popular Christian teaching out there over the past 150 years or so. So if you appreciate this type of long-form biblical teaching, then we would love, if you haven't already, for you to subscribe to the channel. That's the biggest way you can support us. And if you're one of those people that's just like, get on with it, this is too long of an introduction, get to the point already, this channel is probably not the place for you. I don't think you'll really enjoy what we do here. But who knows? Maybe we'll convert you to long-form aficionados. All right, so let's look at the overview of Mark's version of the Olivet Discourse. So in future episodes, like I said, we're going to go through and do kind of an exegesis of Mark 13, and that's the chapter in Mark where the Olivet Discourse is found, all of Mark 13. And like we do with our Psalms videos, when we teach through the Psalms here, I've got the Greek on this side and a very woodenly literal English translation that I put together on this side. And I've got them matching so you can follow even if you don't read Greek. And my Greek is not, my Greek's intermediate at best. But just to do like a flyover of the structure, verses 1 and 2, the disciples ask him, they point to the buildings. Oh, look at how amazing these buildings are. And he says, yeah, it's all coming down. Not one stone's going to be left. Then he goes, in Mark's version, he goes out and he's sitting on the Mount of Olives. And some of the disciples, the original disciples, Peter, James, Andrew, and John, come to him and they ask him this question. Tell us, when will these be? And what's the sign all these are about to be fulfilled? That's literally what it reads in Greek. When will tauta, these, happen or be? And when about to be tauta panta, all these, when are these about to be fulfilled? And so they're asking what Jesus has just said. This whole thing's going to be destroyed and not one stone's going to be left. So that's what kicks off the entire discourse. The disciples follow up with Jesus on him predicting the destruction of the Jerusalem temple and all the buildings surrounding it. So then in verse 5, he begins to teach them. And he starts 5 and 6, he warns about false people. He warns about them being led astray or misled or deceived, that people will come in his name and they'll say, I am. This is ego eimi. This is what Jesus will later say at his trial when they say, tell us, are you the Son of Man? And he'll say, ego eimi. So Jesus says, there's going to be false me's that are going to try to come and lead people astray. And then he warns them in 7 and 8, you're going to hear about wars, you're going to hear rumors of wars, peoples are going to be raised up against peoples, kings against kings. There's going to be tremors, seismoi, either tremors or earthquakes. There's going to be shaking in various places. There will be famines. And then he says, these are the start or the beginning, arche, the beginning of birth pangs. So these aren't the end. These are the beginning. The delivery hasn't even started yet. Then in verse 9, he's going to warn them. He's going to use this phrase, watch yourself, like keep watch. He's going to warn them of persecution. You're going to be handed over to the synagogues. You're going to be beaten. You're going to go before governors and kings as a witness to them. And to the Gentiles, the gospel, the good news will be proclaimed. And so when they lead you away, like when this happens, don't worry beforehand what you're going to say. The Holy Spirit will give you words, but it's going to get down even to families. Brother will betray brother, father to child. Children will rise up against parents and put them to death, and you will be hated because of my name. And he exhorts him, but the one remaining to the end, this one will be saved. So a call for endurance in the face of persecution, even interfamily persecution. Then in verse 14, he makes a cryptic reference. He says, when you see the delugma tes eremoseos, the abomination of desolation, being stood or standing where it must not, let the reader understand. And this is a parenthetical note by Mark. This is not Jesus saying, let the reader understand. Jesus was talking to people who were listening to him, not reading. I should walk that back a little bit. It's possible that Jesus said it meaning, let the reader of Daniel understand, but he doesn't mention Daniel in Mark's version. Matthew will mention that this comes from Daniel. So it's possible, I don't think it's very likely, but it's possible that Jesus said, let the one reading understand, and that this should be in red as well if you're doing red letters, which I'm just doing here for ease of visualization. But I don't think Jesus said, I think Mark said this, and this got passed on as part of this discourse that Matthew, Mark, and Luke all pulled from. Regardless, though, then he makes a reference to Maccabees, let the ones in Judea flee to the mountains. mountains, just as Judas Maccabeus and the people fleeing from the coming wrath of Antiochus, who was seen as the abomination of desolation that would put a stop to sacrifices in the temple, that would set up an altar to Zeus, sacrifice a pig, completely and utterly profane the temple. That's what Antiochus Epiphanes did in the time of the Maccabean rebellion. You can read about this in both 1st and 2nd Maccabees. Those are not in your Bible if you're a Protestant. If you're Catholic or Orthodox, they are in your Bible, but they are Jewish history from that intertestamental period. So he alludes to that and says basically, like the faithful Maccabeans, get out of town. And then he's super adamant that they do it immediately. Like if you're on the roof, don't even go down into your house to get anything, just get out. And roofs, to get to the roof in most Judean houses at the time, you would walk upstairs or a ladder on the outside, like roofs were just the top of the house. And so to get in the house, you would have to actually go down and then go back into the house. And he's like, don't do that. Don't grab anything. If you're in a field, don't go back and get your garment. If you're working in the field, you take your cloak, your garment off. You don't work in the fields in your nice suit. But if that's where you are when all this goes down, get out. Don't even go back to get your cloak. And your cloak was like part of your identity, your garment. You weren't even allowed to take somebody's garment overnight as collateral if you lended them money. Like your cloak was a big deal. And so Jesus is like emphasizing, he's using some of the most emphatic language possible. Get out immediately. And then he goes on to talk about how horrible it's going to be. And woe to pregnant ones and nursing ones, the people that have probably the hardest time traveling rugged terrain, pregnant women and women nursing small children. And that's what Jesus is talking about. And pray that it doesn't happen in bad weather. Some translations say in winter, and hemonos does mean winter, but it also means bad weather. The idea that winter is when bad weather. It's the rainy season. Travel's not easy. And so pray that that's not when this happens. And then he just says those days are going to be worse suffering than has ever been before and ever will be. In fact, if the Lord hadn't shortened those days, none of any flesh, pasa sarx, none of all flesh, like nobody would be saved. But because of the elect ones, whom he elected, the days were shortened. Like God is not going to let it go on indefinitely. And he is going to save his people, the elect, the eklektus, but it's going to be horrendous. And if you saw the last video when Josephus talks about what was happening during this time, you understand just how horrendous it ended up being. And so then he warns them again to watch out for false prophets, false messiahs, literally pseudo-Christoi, false Christs, false messiahs. And so if anybody says, hey, look, here he is, or look, he's out there, don't believe it. They're going to come. They're going to give signs and wonders even to lead astray the eklektus, the chosen ones, the elect ones. But you watch yourselves, be on guard. And then he says, I foretold you everything. Like I am warning you in advance. And then verse 24, he goes into Old Testament prophet mode, actually quoting from a couple of Old Testament prophetic passages sort of combined together. And he says, the sun will be darkened, moon will not give her light or her shine. The stars will be falling from the heavens. The powers in the heavens will be shaken. So that's from a couple of different places in the prophets. We'll look at those in the upcoming video. And then he grabs a passage from Daniel, and then they will see the Son of Man coming on clouds with much power and glory. That's Daniel 7. And then he will send his messengers, or angels, same word, and they will gather his eklektus from the four winds, from the end of the earth to the end of the heavens, like from one end to we'd say from here to Timbuktu. So there's debate about what he's referring to in this section, and we'll look at that in just a second. Then he ends with a parable. He says, but learn the parable from the fig tree. Now, he's already cursed one fig tree when it should have borne fruit and it didn't. And now he's possibly talking about that tree, but it's not likely. He's probably just talking about, in general, the fig tree. When its branch becomes tender and puts forth leaves, know that theros, harvest, is near. And harvest is also the word for summer. So some translations have pray that it doesn't happen in winter. And when the shoot becomes tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer is coming. Those are accurate translations as well. But he's referring to harvest. You know that it's going to be time to harvest figs. Once you see those leaves start to come out from the tender branch, like it's almost time for harvest. Harvest is it's come. You may not know exactly the day you're going to go out and harvest, but it's pretty near. It doesn't take you by surprise. And so he says, thus, when you see these happening, know that it's near at the door. And then he emphatically puts a timestamp on it. He says, I say to you, this generation won't pass away until all these things happen. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my word will never pass away. So he caps it that whatever he's been talking about is going to happen within this generation. Then, verse 32, he says, peride, now about, so it's a slight change of subject. Now concerning that day, he's been talking about those days, these days. Now he switches to the singular, tes hemeres ekenes, that day, etes horas, or the hour. So about that day or the hour, no one knows. Neither the angels in heaven nor the Son, only the Father. So once again, he tells them, blepete, watch, agripnete, be awake, for you don't know when the appointed time, the kairos, is. And then he gives another parable. Like a man on a journey who left his house, gave his servants authority, each with his job, and to the doorkeeper he commanded that he keep watch. Like you also keep watch, therefore, for you don't know when the Lord of the house is coming, whether late or midnight or crowing or morning. And we'll talk about how this literally plays out in the rest of Mark's gospel, because he's going to ask them to keep watch. They're not going to be able to. And then the events of Jesus's arrest and crucifixion are going to happen in these 4 sections of the night, these 4 watches of the night. And so significant things in Mark's gospel are going to happen during these 4 night watches. But he concludes, lest having come suddenly, he finds you sleeping. And what I say to you, I say to all, pasen, everyone, gregorete, keep watch. Stay awake. So that's Mark's version of the Olivet Discourse. Now, the question that interpreters write whole books about is, what are these events referring to? And we looked last episode how Josephus talks about the events leading up to and surrounding 70 AD, and how a lot of what Jesus talks about fits like a glove the things that Josephus talked about, especially the false teachers rising up, the horrendous suffering worse than has ever been before, the temple itself being destroyed, even down to not one stone being left on the other. But the question that really divides interpreters, at least like really good interpreters of Mark, is what in the Olivet Discourse is talking about 70 AD and what is talking about what we would call the second coming, Jesus's parousia. Because that's where the real division is. Now, in popular teaching, like, some of the Left Behind stuff and even some of the liberal critical stuff that says Jesus, predicted the end of the world before 70 AD, and it didn't happen, and he was a false prophet. Albert Schweitzer and others have kind of gone that route, the critical route, and some have even said, well, the Olivet Discourse wasn't even original to Jesus, more out of embarrassment than anything. And so leaving those aside, like the dispensational futurist, it's all Jesus is talking about the end of the world and the stars falling from the sky and the moon turning dark, all the blood moons nonsense. If you don't know what I'm talking about with blood moons nonsense, check out the video that we did here on the channel about blood moons nonsense. So all of that sensationalist stuff, rapture stuff, not referring to any of that. But even among scholars who say, no, this does go back to Jesus. Jesus said this stuff. And 2, Jesus wasn't wrong. Even among those interpreters, there's still a divide on how Mark should be structured. And the easiest way, I think, to convey it is to just show it to you visually. So I've taken 3 representative approaches, and these are kind of the first 2 especially, like N.T. Wright, one of the most well-known New Testament scholars, universally respected. Even when people disagree with N.T. Wright, they still respect N.T. Wright. If they don't, that's probably a clue that where their scholarship is. I would take whatever they teach with a tiny grain of salt. N.T. Wright is pretty universally acknowledged as a competent New Testament scholar. And he's also the one who's probably given the most persuasive case for reading Mark the way he does. Another eminent New Testament scholar who's done work on the Olivet Discourse is R.T. France. And R.T. France and N.T. Wright, as you're going to see, they agree on the majority of Mark 13. But at the very end, R.T. France says, actually, N.T. Wright doesn't quite get it correct. And so he tweaks something. Then there's another view, and these aren't the same, but they're kind of, at least I think they're similar enough to group them together. Morna Hooker and Andrew Lepeau, I think that's how you say his name. They take a slightly different approach. And there are other examples as well. I can think of like Craig Keener or Craig Evans, William Lane, numerous other interpreters. But these three, I think, are fairly representative, or at least what I would say 3 of the most persuasive ways to approach the Olivet Discourse. If you're interested in these, by the way, N.T. Wright's can be found in his Jesus and the Victory of God. This is volume 2 in his New Testament Origins series. This is where he really makes his case for this reading of Mark 13. He also touches on it in Mark for Everyone, in his New Testament for Everyone series, which is very popular level. This is scholarly writing. And then for popular level, Mark for Everyone, which I have digitally, I don't have a hard copy of. And then R.T. France's volume on Mark in the New International Greek Testament Commentary series. Now, this is not that volume. This is Greg Beale's volume on Revelation, because I only have France's volume digitally in my Accordance library. But this is the commentary set that it's from. This is what it looks like if you want to track it down. This is technical. You need to know Greek, at least some Greek, to be able to really work with this. And then Morna Hooker and Lepeau's, you can find them in, Morna Hooker's is in the Black's New Testament Commentary series. And then Lepeau's is in the very recent, from Kregel, Mark Through Old Testament Eyes. Kregel's been publishing a number of these New Testament commentaries, in this case Mark, from the perspective of people who are primarily Old Testament scholars. It's a great series. I have over on the shelf, Karen Jobes did the volume on John, Trimper Longman did the volume on Revelation. It's a great series. I've really enjoyed it. And so what you're going to find in these, in terms of Mark's overall structure of the Olivet Discourse, is what we have on screen. They all agree that the disciples asking Jesus about the buildings, that's what starts it. So everything then after verse 5, Wright says it's all describing the events from the 40s, around the 40s AD until 70 AD. That's what Jesus is going to be describing. And N.T. Wright argues in Jesus and the Victory of God in particular that everything that Jesus says in Mark 13, all of it, even the Lord coming back to his house, that is not referring to Jesus's second coming. It's all what the disciples asked about, which is, when will these be, and what's the sign when all these are about to be fulfilled? Like the destruction of Jerusalem is what they're asking him about. And that's going to be, Wright argues, simultaneously both judgment on Jerusalem and vindication of Jesus as the Son of God, as a true prophet, and as the rightful Messiah of Israel. So that's how Wright reads all of it. And we'll look at that in a subsequent video. France says, yeah, when he's talking about, watch out and all these things that are going to start happening, yeah, all of this is talking about the 40s to 70 AD as well. And that part about the sun being darkened, the moon not giving its light, the Son of Man coming on the clouds with glory, all of that, yes, that's all talking about the judgment of Jerusalem, the destruction of Jerusalem, and particularly the destruction of the temple. And it's using Old Testament language. And Jesus tells us this because he says, this generation will not pass away until all these things happen. And generations, roughly 40-ish years. So that's all of this is about 70 AD. But then France says, but Jesus switches in verse 32, that peri now concerning, and he goes on to switch to that day and hour. So he's gone from talking about the events of 70 AD that he knows are going to happen within that generation to the events of the parousia, the second coming, that not even he knows when that's going to happen. And so therefore, in this tail end of the discourse, verses 32 through 37, Jesus is using kind of the events of 70 AD and their knowability to springboard off to talk about what they foreshadow, which is the coming, the second coming, and that's not knowable. So whereas you can get ready for all this stuff, and Jesus can warn them and they can flee, and they did. Most Christians weren't in Jerusalem when this happened. I think Eusebius says that most of the Christians had fled to Pella over in Jordan. And whether that's true or not, Jesus's followers had scattered long before this stuff happened. But France says the second coming, nobody knows when that's going to happen. So you have to always be ready. Like live in a state of readiness. And then Hooker, LaPoe, others have suggested kind of a blending of those. I think even Keener hinted at it, although he doesn't develop it much at least in his Matthew commentary. I haven't read his work on Mark. But what they say is, yes, it starts out asking about when these events are going to happen, the destruction of the temple being the main one. And so Jesus starts warning them about the events from 40s to 70 AD. And then both Hooker and LaPoe say, but when he switches in verse 24 to start talking about, however, in those days after that suffering, like after everything he's warned them about, he switches and starts talking about the sun being darkened, the moon not giving its light, and the Son of Man coming in the clouds, that this is talking about the second coming. And that's when, he'll send his angels or messengers and they'll gather the elect from the forward. So this is all talking about the end, the parousia. Then it's like A, B, A, B. So then he jumps back to, in verse 28, a parable about this first section, all this 70 AD stuff. He jumps back to a parable, the parable of the fig tree, and how you can know that 70 AD is about to happen. Like you can know, they didn't know it as 70 AD in Jesus's day, but after that, it's like 9/11. Like everybody, you don't even have to say what you're talking about. Everybody knows 9/11. Oh, we know what you're talking about. Well, 70 AD, we know what you're talking about. And so he was giving them a parable about 70 AD first. And then just like he switched to talking about the second coming, like the end, then he gives a parable about the second coming. And that's the person going away and, nobody knows when the owner of the house is going to come back. So you have to stay awake. And so they account for the fact that he does put a cap on it and says this generation won't pass away until all these things happen. They say, yeah, because that section, verses 28 through 31, this is talking about 70 AD. So all three of these interpretations, what they all have in common is none of them have to do what many traditional interpretations have had to do, many fundamentalist interpretations, futurist interpretations, or even critical interpreters who just assume that anything talking about the sun being darkened and the Son of Man coming is referring to the second coming. None of these views demand that. And so none of these views are embarrassed by the fact that Jesus says this generation won't pass away until these things happen, because he's talking about, in all three views, he's talking about the events of 70 AD, which did happen, as we saw in the last video, with stunning accuracy before that generation had passed away. So any of those three approaches, I think, are valid. I kind of lean towards one maybe a little more than the other. And even one of them, as we'll see in the next video probably, has kind of modified their approach in light of maybe some of the arguments. But they're all valid. These are all, I think, ways that you can read the Olivet Discourse and make sense of it as it's written. Not having to say things like, oh, well, generation doesn't really mean this generation. It means like this race, or it means that generation, like the generation that'll be alive when all these things happen. Just the way that kind of fundamentalist and critical scholars have had to do exegetical backflips in order to make Jesus not be saying, this generation is not going to pass away before these things I'm telling you has happened, and referring to that actual generation. So I would commend any of these views, and we'll unpack them a little bit more in the next video when we start to go through the Olivet Discourse and look at some of these Old Testament passages he was pulling from. And I'll read you, some of the thoughts from each of these contributors and maybe a few others, so that by the end of it, again, it's not like I'm saying you have to take this view of what Jesus is talking about in the Olivet Discourse. But this is like, the Olivet Discourse is one of the most challenging of all of Jesus's teachings. And there's been centuries of debate about it. So this series is to be sort of a bridge, an entry point for you as a committed, serious, interested Bible reader to get a lay of the land of what's going on, and then be able to study it from a more informed position, historically, exegetically, literarily, because it matters, as we're going to see. It really does matter. But that'll do it for now. This, like I said, we're trying to kind of slowly bring everything in focus, zooming in. If you want to, instead of the 30,000 foot airplane metaphor, if you want to use like a photography metaphor, we've framed the shot, and now we're adjusting the focus. And in the next episode, I don't know what the next thing would be, color grading, I don't know, looking at the details. But that'll do it for now. Again, if you appreciate this type of long form teaching, if you haven't already, please subscribe. It really does help us when you do. Also, if you want to partner with Disciple Dojo, we're not funded by our YouTube revenue. We are funded by our ministry donors. If you would like to become a Disciple Dojo donor, any dollar amount, we don't have like tiers of membership or any of that stuff. Just if you're able to give $1 a month, $1,000 a month, whatever you're able to do, we greatly appreciate as a 501c3 nonprofit. I don't oversee any of that. That's all handled by our finance director and our board. But if you do become a dojo donor, or you are currently a dojo donor, and you like the patch that you see me wearing on a couple of the hats that I have, well, we have some of those, and I would love to send you one, whichever color you'd want, either the light or the dark. All you have to do, if you are a donor, is just use the contact form on the website to shoot me a message that says, hey, I'm a Disciple Dojo donor. I'd love a patch. Let me know which color you'd like and your address, and I will happily stick one in the mail and get it your way as just a small token of appreciation for the support that this ministry wouldn't be able to function without it. It's incredibly crucial. And so I'm super thankful for all of you, particularly those of you who are actual monthly donors. You really probably have no idea how important your support is, but it really is. Also, we have new designs. If you notice, I'm wearing a new Keep Training shirt. This is the same design that's also on our awesome Disciple Dojo lunch boxes. We just have fun stuff over in our online store. It's more of just like, I like putting creative designs out there and seeing what people are interested in. But if you want to pick one up, they're fully customizable. I like this yellowish color, but you can get one in whatever color you want. Check those out. I will put a link right here on the screen to our online store. We got all kinds of crazy stuff over there, flip-flops, yoga pants, lunch boxes, our timeline coffee mug of the Hebrew Bible. So just another way that you can support this ministry. That'll do it for now, though. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for more on Mark 13, the Olivet Discourse. And as always, in the meantime, keep training.